Me to get started?
Yep, go for it.
Awesome. Well, hi everybody. My name is Marina Dawson and I'm the Manager of Community and Content with Charity Village. It's such a pleasure being here with you all today. I want to thank PLEO for hosting this very timely and informative webinar and also inviting us at Charity Village to participate. I'm so pleased to be representing Charity Village here today. Many of you will know us as Canada's largest online job board for the nonprofit sector. And in fact, we are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. On the Charity Village website, you can of course post your organization's jobs and you can search for job opportunities in the sector as well. And we've worked really hard over the past 25 years to become the career destination site and trusted HR partner for the sector in Canada. Just a bit of background, we did launch a new website at the beginning of this year, and the plan for 2020 had been to add some new resources around early stage talent acquisition. However, like many of your organizations, COVID came along and impacted things. We did hit the pause button, took some time to consider some different options, and I'm very pleased to say we're now investing in some new services that are going to be helpful in the current work environment as organizations are of course dealing with both COVID and COVID-related impacts. Soon we'll be offering video pre-assessment screening and live video interviewing that will be wrapped around our existing job ads. And soon to follow after that will be options for automated reference and background checking, which will make hiring both in-person and virtual more efficient. We've also taken the time to consider our e-learning course topics, looking at what would be timely and relevant both in the near-term work environment as well as for the future. And I'm pleased to say that we'll be unrolling some expanded content later this summer around working virtually, planning and running virtual events, running virtual volunteer programs, and digital marketing and social media for fundraising. We are also going to have some advanced courses on budgeting and board governance. So do stay tuned for more information on those initiatives. Please follow us on social media or subscribe to our newsletters for all the latest updates. And just finally, I want to say that in my role as Manager of Community and Content, I spend a lot of my time creating and compiling articles and resources for nonprofit professionals, board members, and volunteers. So I do encourage you to head over to charityvillage.com, even if you're not hiring or looking for work, and you can access all the free services we offer to the sector. You can post volunteer opportunities and events for free, read thousands of articles in our online library, or register for one of the dozens of free webinars that we host every year. Like PLEO, we make our webinar recordings available, so you can also browse past sessions. I'd just like to say, please reach out to me directly at any time if you're looking for specific resources or you need assistance finding anything on the Charity Village website, or I'm always happy to link you with other organizations as well. You can reach me directly at marina@charityvillage.com. Thank you so much. And again, big thank you to PLEO for organizing today's webinar. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Marina. So my name's Martha Rands. I'm the Director of Programs and Interim Managing Director of the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society. And I want to begin today by acknowledging that we work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, and we thank them for their forbearance of our participation on their lands. Particularly, our activities are across many different areas. We have a legal clinic for artists called the Artists Legal Outreach, and we also operate a project called the Law for Nonprofits Project. As part of that, we offer regular webinars and workshops. And I encourage anyone who is listening from the Black, Indigenous, and communities of color across the country, if you have any particular needs or issues that you're not seeing represented in this environment, please let us know. We would be happy to make available some resources, some people to support the really, really important work that the communities, both Black, Indigenous, and all communities are doing at a time of tremendous strife and pressure in an environment of white supremacy, et cetera. So without further ado, there is one task I would ask each of the 328 participants to do. At the bottom of your screen, there is something called polling. And next week, we are going to the Budget Committee, Finance Committee of the province of British Columbia. And we are asking you today to tell us whether or not you would like to see or benefit from a legal clinic for nonprofits. And the results of that poll will be shared with the Finance Committee next week and with our colleagues in the sector across the country. Today, we're going to be talking about virtual AGMs. Also at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box. I am going to be moderating the session today and the session features our guest today is Anders Oram. Both Anders and I are Vancouver-based lawyers, and as many of you know, we've sent you emails to tell you that we're both qualified to practice here. We are going to do our best to make the session as general as possible to cover the kinds of questions that people from across the country will have, including many of you from Ontario that we know are on the webinar today. Anders is an experienced expert in areas relating to governance and the Societies Act. His private practice is dedicated to nonprofits and charities, and I'm really grateful for his willingness to continue to work with PLEO on making available information to the sector. We will be following up the session today with an info sheet that Anders has developed with much of the content today. So without further ado, welcome Anders. Why don't you just launch into the presentation today?
Thank you, Martha, and thank you to PLEO and CharityVillage for hosting today's session. I hope I am audible and visible. If not, you'd better send a message to the moderator or to the CharityVillage organizer. So this session derives, of course, out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also from a session that PLEO did about 8 weeks ago on simply to tell societies in BC that, yes, for the duration of the pandemic, you can hold a virtual annual general meeting. Here are some of the structural legal background to that. So today's session is more on how to actually do it. And the presumption is that with the pandemic, we're not going to be able to hold in-person annual meetings, at least until this autumn, and probably significantly longer from what they're saying now. Of course, that there's a small catch to that, which is that it seems to me, and in fact, I've done it once or twice in the last few weeks, is that you can hold an annual meeting outside if you are careful about the size of the number of attendees and get it organized so everybody's spaced. The limitations, of course, are weather, and that you don't have use of much technology if you're outside in a park or a parking lot or something. But it may be a possibility for the next while and shouldn't be forgotten. In any event, we're going to talk today about a bit about the mechanics. This is general thoughts and comments based on what the legalities are and experience over the last few months particularly. So please don't be taking it to the credit union. You need to figure out what will work for your organization and what is legally permissible and required. So I'm assuming that most of the attendees in some way are involved with a nonprofit in Canada, which is incorporated under one or another provincial statute or territorial statute or the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. If you're not, then this may not be of a lot of help. So given that you're required to hold an annual meeting of the members once a year, each statute seems to say that much at least, although my knowledge, of course, is limited to the Societies Act and the CNCA, as everyone calls it. So you need to first then, before actually organizing a virtual annual meeting, that is to say teleconference, video conference, some mixture, first look at the statute your organization is incorporated under and any emergency order of that jurisdiction. For example, in BC, the Societies Act since 2016 has allowed virtual annual AGMs unless the bylaws said that you couldn't have one, which is pretty uncommon. In fact, the provincial government in mid-April issued an emergency order permitting all societies to hold virtual annual general meetings for the duration. But that's BC. If you're in another province, I can't speak to that and you need to check. First, the incorporation statute. Second, any emergency order that the jurisdiction might have issued. And then lastly, what your bylaws actually say about what's required and permitted for an annual general meeting. And you need to get all of those, look at them carefully and see, can you hold a virtual annual meeting? Then, assuming that you can, the meeting has to take much the same format and much the same business as would be regularly required. It's just that people aren't in the same room together. And that's what we're going to work around today. Generally, it's worth mentioning that in BC at least, and I think across Canada, many of the court cases relating to societies arise out of improper procedure or allegedly improper procedure at an annual general meeting and related things. It's important to remember at all times that the meeting is a right of the members, and both legally and in terms of democracy. So please keep that in mind. If you're going to have a meeting, it's important that the members be able to communicate with each other in real time. The meeting we're having right now, that isn't possible because you can hear me, but I can't hear you. Of course, that's a structural thing with a webinar. It's not an AGM, but nonetheless, everybody has to be able to hear each other continuously and be able to talk with each other. And if the technology allows to see each other. One catch is if for some reason you're required to have a secret ballot, for example, on an election. If that's the case, it gets more complicated because in a meeting, well, everybody would be issued a little paper ballot and they would mark their choices on it and they would give the ballots to the parliamentarian who would collect them with scrutineers and report on the results of the election. That's somewhat harder to do electronically, and we'll get to that later. But Martha has been quite good at emphasizing how important this is. So next, the notice of the meeting needs to provide clear instructions to the members on how they can attend and participate. This is one where you have to be very aware of the character and nature of your members. It has to be something that works for them, and you have to tell them from point to point what they need to do to participate. Unlike all of us, lucky 328 or however many people, members of many societies aren't as familiar with this kind of technology, and they don't necessarily have a teenager available to walk them through it on the day of the meeting. So that's basically facilitation. And then you basically have to comply with the bylaws. The notice of the meeting date, time, details about how to participate, what the agenda is, etc. Any special business like special resolutions. So that's a step. Then the next step is a kind of a chicken and egg step. But what I strongly encourage people to do is, if they possibly can, try out the different technologies. And one of the easy ways to do that is to go to other societies or other organizations' meetings, see what they did, what worked and what didn't, what platform they used. Often, everybody's learning at a tremendous rate. You can call them and ask, hey, what worked for you, what didn't, what can you tell us? There are a number of platforms out there, and unfortunately, I offered to put in a plug for them, but none of them were willing to pay. It was going to be 50-50 to PLEO and CharityVillage, just so we're clear. In any case, there's a number of platforms. For the teleconference or video conference, you have to do the research into terms of what is available, what works, what it costs. And then the board of the organization, advised by management and possibly professionals, needs to decide and go from there. So with a couple of thoughts, teleconference, well, that's easier to organize. You simply call somebody at TELUS or Bell or whatever, and you say, I want to have a teleconference, and you get your special call-in number and so forth. But people can't see each other, and so for a small group, that might work better. For a larger group, maybe not so well. Kind of thing that you need to think about. If you're going to have a secret ballot, you may need to get some kind of an enhanced program, or possibly do so separately. I was in a meeting last week where they held the meeting using Zoom, and at one point they had to have a secret ballot, and they had it set up with SurveyMonkey. I don't remember who was actually responsible for tallying and reporting on the votes, but that's how they took care of it. But that adds a layer of complication. You also need to think that, okay, members, normally in a meeting, you register the members as they come through the door. You have the register of members to show who's a current member. You tick them off. That's a little harder to do electronically. I did see 300 or so names go whizzing by in the small print on the bottom of my screen, but I'm afraid I wasn't able to keep track of you all. And again, if you have a larger group, that requires a bit more planning, both to make sure that you've registered all the members who are present and that only members are present, because only members, generally speaking, and the auditor have the legal right to be at your general meeting. Part of that may mean that you're going to have to not just inform members, but even train them a little bit. Another group I was with at their meeting last week, they actually had a sort of a little training meeting the night before, where people could basically check in that, oh, okay, this is how it works, and yes, everything's okay, and I'm ready to go. And that seemed to give a lot of comfort to some of the members. Of course, you need to think about where members meet. I have some clients that are in very small and remote communities. They have limited internet, and a meeting such as this would probably not be possible based there. Someone there might be able to dial into a meeting such as we're having, but you can't necessarily count on it. You need to think about what is a convenient time for the members. Believe it or not, I had somebody that suggested that they have their annual meeting at 7 a.m. And I didn't think that, of course, by virtual means. And I don't think I needed to see them all in their pajamas. And in any case, it really wasn't a practicable time. Obviously, a typical time would be on say a Saturday afternoon, or early in the evening during the week, that type of thing. Bearing in mind that there are some people that like to make a lot of noise at 7 o'clock these days, and you have to keep that in mind. And also that if you were to say schedule a meeting for 9 a.m., that's a high traffic time on the internet and people might have trouble calling in or dialing in. You need to think about what culture your organization has for annual meetings. Do you like to have longer meetings with lots of member involvement, or relatively short business-like meetings? Well, for this year at least, the two things I would suggest to keep things simple. If possible, make sure that the elections are, all you're doing is announcing the results. You're not actually doing nominations and voting at the meeting. Doing it virtually can get pretty complicated quickly. And really keeping things simple. My view is if it's an hour or maybe not much more, that's enough to cover the usual business that an annual meeting should cover or is legally required to cover. If you can postpone special resolutions, for example, to amend the Constitution or bylaws, maybe a good time to do so. If you can avoid having any secret ballots, also a very good time to do that. Keeping it simple. And of course, communicating with your members that very clearly, hey, we are having a meeting. It's legally necessary. It will do what's needed. For this year, we would like to avoid doing much more than what is needed. Please keep that in mind. If you really do have some urgent business or something to do with, say, nominations, please communicate with us beforehand. Set a process for these things. So a few people have asked me, well, does it have to be something that works for every organization and all its members? And no, the analogy is ordinarily you have your organization, it has its annual meeting, you send out a notice. Well, let's say you're based in a given city and some of the members live elsewhere. They're still interested, but they live elsewhere. Well, that doesn't mean you have to, just because they're members and have a right to attend, they've also chosen to live somewhere else. You have no obligation to fly them down for the meeting. The same goes with the technology side. Just because you're having a video conference and that's how it has to be, well, that doesn't mean that you certainly have to make reasonable efforts to facilitate members attending. That doesn't mean that you have to buy them all iPhones or iPads or whatever it is, or have a tech support person with each of the members telling them how to make it work. It's finding a reasonable balance. And of course, if it works for 10% of your members, that's pretty marginal. If it works for 90%, that's great. I don't know where the sweet spot is, will depend on your organization. So the components to the meeting are, and all of this will be in a paper which Martha and I are working on, which will be circulated if I'm correct. So she nodded her head. So the components of the meeting are going to be pretty much the same as you would normally send, only this year you're probably going to send everything electronically if you didn't already do so. Again, check your bylaws, but if they say things like notice of the annual general meeting must be in writing, well, unless the bylaws or the statutes specifically say otherwise, writing is now considered to include email. You just need to keep good records of what things you have sent, when you sent it, who you sent it to, so that if the issue ever arises, you can say, look, we sent everything to the address that the member provided, the email. If it didn't get there, we're not responsible. No different than if somebody moves physically and the mail with the notice of the annual meeting isn't forwarded. not your problem. You can't herd everybody. So the notice of the annual meeting must usually be sent 14 days or more before the AGM. You check your statute and your bylaws for what's specifically required. Add some extra time if possible to allow time for delivery, and don't include the day of the meeting or the day the notice is sent. So we all know of organizations where they'd say, oh, today's June 10th, we're sending our notice of our annual meeting for June 24th. Everything's okay? Probably not quite. Add 3 or 4 days to that just to be on the safe side. The other things you'll need are the documents that I mentioned earlier, especially the bylaws. You want to make sure that whatever you believe are the bylaws really are the bylaws as on file with the incorporation jurisdiction, because they're going to tell you about can you hold the meeting, or how you must hold the meeting, how much notice needs to be given, what is a quorum, who's allowed to vote, if any votes must be conducted by secret ballot, which is quite unusual, how nominations are to be conducted and elections to be conducted, and who gets to be the chair. It's basically your user's manual. The user's manual for the AGM is your bylaws. They'll mostly tell you what needs to be done. The notice should also include clear information about participation and such support as you can provide. In my view, the notice this year is a golden opportunity to be very clear and upfront with members about things like nominations, elections, resolutions, and so on, so that nobody can come to the annual meeting and say, oh, I thought we were going to just do nominations as usual today. And you say, well, no, we told you in the notice nominations were going to take place in advance, and we didn't hear from you. Something like that anyway. The notice can also include a detailed agenda if you want, including a timeline. The usual reports, the minutes of the last AGM, director's report, annual financial statement with the auditor's report if applicable, and possibly a report of a nominations committee if you're that far ahead of the game. If not, information about nominations and elections so that that's taken care of. If you really must, a special resolution, you must send the notice of that with the notice of the annual meeting. So that would be included in the package going to members. And a last one would be possibly rules of order, which may actually be tailored for use at a virtual AGM. And typically the rules of order that matter for most nonprofits can be covered in about 2 pages. And however, you do need to think about that in terms of the process for a virtual AGM. So that if your usual rules of order say that a member can speak twice, well, maybe for this year, you should suggest once. And whatever rules of order you're proposing would be circulated and adopted at the start of the AGM. As a side note, despite what some may believe, things like Robert's Rules of Order don't necessarily apply, in fact, usually don't, unless they've been adopted. And they can be very unwieldy to apply in reality. So if you're anticipating a meeting has a more active membership, you need to think about, should we propose some rules of order and what should they look like? And how are they going to work? So let's see what else. Subscriptions. If you get you find a platform that works, look at what it provides, maybe give it a test. You're probably going to have to pay something for it. Neither Martha nor I think that we know of anything that's truly free. although there may be some things that appear to be free. No free lunch though. I mentioned the possibility of having a test run with the technology on your members. We'll see. Now, I should say it's now 12:30 for me. What I'd like to do is continue until about 10 to 1, unless Martha intrudes. And then we'll have the last 10 minutes or so for questions or discussion. So I'll continue on that basis, unless Martha says not. So for the meeting and the notice of the meeting, you may want to tell members that they have to pre-register for the meeting, either using whatever platform you have or simply by sending a message, I plan to attend the annual meeting. And that gives you a better idea of who's there, what particular considerations you may need to have. And also, you also have a good idea of if you're going to have quorum, which whatever else, please make sure you have quorum by whatever proper means you possibly can, because postponing an AGM because you don't have quorum is really a nuisance. And right now, I think it's even more of a nuisance. Also, if you're making people pre-register, then you can check that they are in fact all members and in good standing with their dues paid up and therefore eligible to attend and vote. You don't need non-members attending. I talked already about nominations and elections. Often bylaws don't say a lot about it, and then there's practices where the existing directors will appoint a nominations committee. It's charged with finding enough nominees to fill the expected vacancies. It reports and presents what you might call a slate. Everybody holds up their hand and agrees with it. If your organization has a culture or experience of contested elections, you're going to need to think a little bit more about how that's going to work. If the organization is more or less follows the first example I gave, that makes it a little easier, but you will need to communicate with the members before the meeting with the notice. It's okay, we're having an election. Here's who the current directors are. Here's whose terms are expiring. Here's who is running for re-election. Here's how many expected vacancies we expect, if any. And then instructions on if you want to nominate somebody, here's how to do so. You send the message to the nominations committee. Here's the chair. You has to be signed by 2 members or approved by 2 members. And things of that nature, so that when the date by which the nomination must be received. It essentially so that there are no surprises. It may be that it's all really boilerplate and there's no issue, but you don't want there to be an issue, and preparation and communication will help on that. Okay, then the next consideration will be members checking in on the date of the meeting. And again, you need some way to check their names against the register of members if the system doesn't somehow do it for you already. As we see from today's meeting and so many others, you may need someone to chair it, usually your chair or president. Separately, you may need somebody to monitor the technology and make sure it's all behaving, and that if somebody sends in a message or raises their hand, that you're responding. But you do need to be prepared for that. And you need to tell members that, okay, for example, let's say you decide that we're not going to unmute the members unless they raise a hand, which is probably the most prudent approach to go with. Many of these programs seem to have a function where you click a button or whatever, and it tells the moderator that you want to say something, and then when the time comes, they unmute you. Members will need to be educated about that, given that the a normal AGM, they get to do that in real time. They stand up and wave their hand and say, Madam Chair, Madam Chair. Well, that's not going to happen in a virtual AGM. Leaving the platform open so that everyone is unmuted at all times. Again, if with a small group, especially if they know each other reasonably well, that can work. As the group gets larger and as the issues get more challenging, keeping people muted until they raise their hand is probably the most prudent approach. Another issue that may come up is many nonprofits allow their members to renew their membership as they register for the AGM. You come through the door, you fill in a new form, you put in your 20 bucks plus and so forth. Obviously that is not possible electronically. So the advance information to members with the notice of the meeting, you may want to include clear information about, okay, you will not be able to renew your membership at the AGM. You can renew it in advance. Here's how to do so. If you don't, then you may not be allowed to vote because you won't be in good standing. Separately, you tell them no new memberships at the AGM, in case that wasn't obvious already, but there's no way to process them or take care of them. Again, I think at this point, many members of societies and those involved are getting familiar with the possibilities and the real limitations of virtual meetings, but there's never any harm in reiterating those things so that no one can later say that they were upset about it. So, the process for the meeting, and you have to work backwards from this to say, okay, how are we going to make this work? First, somebody, the chair or the moderator, is controlling everything else. So you've got basically the chair has control over what happens, who can talk, what business is, possibly what documents pop up on people's screens, which are being discussed in the meeting. That's certainly a possibility for reports and financial statements. Then, introduce the chair. You have some kind of a roll call or at least an announcement with regard to quorum. Adopting rules of order, approving if needed, approving the agenda. This is all the standard business which you pretty much have to do one way or the other. There may be add-ons. So there'd be the minutes of the last AGM, consider and approve, report of the board for the last year, and one add-on for that for many organizations will be a separate report of some kind where the members are going to say, well, how are we doing now? The board report and the year end was March 31st. It's now August. A lot has happened in the world in the meantime. Can we have an update, please? So something to consider where you might not normally do that because the AGM is primarily relating to the last fiscal year. Financial statements and auditor's report, is a mandatory thing. I don't think there's any exceptions. So that needs to get dealt with. Appointing the auditor if there is one. Electing directors if required. Now, for that, often the actual vote occurs at the AGM, even if it's simply a resolution to approve the slate that has been nominated. So you present the report, you ask for an ordinary resolution to approve the report with the nominations. Someone seconds it and you have a vote. You should set that up in advance. We're probably all familiar with those dead silences at AGMs where the chair desperately pleads for somebody to move a motion, completely ordinary routine motion, and there's dead silence. well, this is not a meeting where you need dead silence. Rig it. You talk with get all of the directors, where Director A will present the report of the nominations committee. Director B will move that the report be accepted and that certain people be elected for the coming year. Director C will second that, just to keep things moving along. I'm sorry, that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, is those dead silences. And then, of course, any special business, such as a special resolution, or possibly to some extent questions and answers or discussion with the members, if time allows and you want to. If not, you're not required to have that. And then finally, adjourning. So that would be the business you would generally cover in a virtual meeting. And then you, as I say, you need to think about, okay, so this is working virtually. So whoever is the moderator needs to know that the chair will ask for a motion to approve the report of the nominations committee or the minutes of the last AGM or whatever. You know in advance who's going to move and second those, so you unmute them briefly to allow them to do it. Things like that. Keeps it moving along. As is probably fairly clear, another key piece to all of this is going to be the chair of the meeting. The chair is going to have to be prepared, think through, okay, what if A happens, what will I do? If B happens, what will I do? Given that you're the person in the hot seat and you're not only managing the meeting, you're to some extent managing and doing traffic control for the technology. So whoever is the chair, this is a good meeting to prepare. And to be honest, now that we're all suddenly having to use this kind of technology for meetings, well, probably more and more organizations will choose to do so. And based on present information, there's every possibility that in-person AGMs may not even be possible, by next spring, if that. So you may be doing your annual meeting next year virtually as well, and keep that in mind. This is probably not a one-shot deal. So I'm looking at my little summary document thing. And as we talked about nominations and elections earlier, and again, often the process is a little bit informal, but it works. This year, I advise being a little bit more structured and formal, bearing in mind what the bylaws actually require. And a reason that it's important is nominating and electing directors is a right of the members as set out in the bylaws. And so when it comes to the rights of members, you have to be fairly careful not to abridge them if it's possible to avoid it. For example, if your bylaws simply say that, they say it as the very basic bylaws sometimes say that, well, there must be 3 directors or such greater number as may be determined at the general meeting. And then it says the directors must be elected at the annual general meeting and have terms of 1 year. That's pretty standard. People build processes on top of that. Some bylaws are clearer about the processes for nominations and elections. But if you've got those basic bylaws, you have to think about, well, what happens if one member shows up at the annual meeting, so to speak, and insists that they have a right to nominate somebody there and then. It's an interesting legal question. You don't really want to go there. That's why the informing members in advance and getting them involved is key to the whole business of nominations elections, if you need one. Special resolutions, well, they are usually to do with constitutions and bylaws. If you've got to go ahead with one, well, you have to go ahead with them. The notice must be sent with notice of the meeting, electronically, of course. And usually 2/3, and in some organizations and jurisdictions, 3/4 of the members present at the meeting have to vote in favor. So that's another one where it's going to take some thought. Again, the more lively your particular democracy, the more thought you will need to put into, okay, we need to get 2/3 of them to vote in favor. I guess we better tell them in advance exactly what's going on and why this is needed. Again, you don't want to be scrambling at the AGM for to defend a resolution where even a few members have questions or object to it. So the last one subject, the main subject I had was about secret ballots. And again, we've talked about that a bit before. So the simple answer is no. Do the most you possibly can to avoid having a secret ballot and to discourage any possible thought of it amongst the members. It's just going to complicate life greatly, and it's possible, but it's going to take preparation and planning. You might have to have a separate technology. You might have to, who's going to count them? Is it going to be, given that it's a secret ballot, whoever counts them has to know that they're valid ballots. That is, they're cast by members who have the right to vote, but you're not allowed to know who it was after they're counted and reported. We all are familiar with processes for elections. So if you need a secret ballot for an election, well, somehow, by hook or by crook, make sure that you only have enough candidates for the positions that are available and that it is a fait accompli. There are ways to do it. I've experienced one or two in the last few weeks. Let's just say that the systems could be improved. So that's a lunchtime tour of some thoughts around how you can organize a virtual AGM. I will, if it's okay, I'll turn it back to Martha and we'll see if there's any questions. Great.
Thanks, Anders. So once again, for everyone who's listening, we will have an info sheet that will follow, and we'll also look at having over the summer some of our law students look at, perhaps we'll create an exhaustive or non-exhaustive list of all the possible platforms. And as well, a number of you have asked questions about rules of procedure. And I do know that, when we start talking about rules of procedure, people sort of revert to Robert's rules because they've heard of it. And if we can create or find a few examples of others, we will make those available. We have a few volunteer law students over the summer. May take some time, so but we will try to get some of that out. So Anders, one of the first questions came in, two actually that are related. Does communicating through a chat function count as being able to communicate continuously?
Well, I could read the wording of the emergency order from the government of BC, and I think I will because I can probably find it quite quickly. Probably should have done so already. Here we are. I'll read. So this is an emergency order of the Solicitor General of BC, issued in March. And so the wording in it says, a person who is entitled to participate in an AGM may do so by telephone or other communications medium if all of the persons participating, whether by telephone, by other communications, or in person, are able to communicate with each other and, if applicable, vote at the meeting. So it's a matter of what will work given that. I would seem to me that if a technology allows real-time interaction, even with a chat room, that would be acceptable because it says communicate. It doesn't say talk.
Right.
It doesn't say see.
Yeah.
And actually, I should say I've had a couple of clients that were organizations that worked with persons who are hearing impaired, and they've been doing their meetings that way forever.
Yeah. And there are, for example, when you have somebody captioning, there will be a script created, as well as there's various mechanisms through which you could actually document that there was quite a bit of communication around whatever the issues were that arose during the annual general meeting. So I think the answer to that question is more than likely yes. It's going to be most important where, as Anders put it, you have an active membership. I talk about mischievous members. You want to make sure that if you know that you've got people that have an issue or their knickers in a knot, as it were, that you're prepared to address them in whatever way is going to be necessary. Someone else asks whether or not you have to have people unmuted the whole time during an AGM. So if they were using this platform, namely Zoom, and in order for there to be order, I think you would need to be able to mute people. And I think that's what you were getting to when you said prudence, correct?
Yes. Strictly speaking, even in a in-person AGM, the members are muted until they're recognized by the chair anyway.
Yeah.
And now separately, two other things that occurred to me is don't forget to provide for somebody to keep minutes of the meeting. And you may consider recording it, although if you do, you probably should inform your members that it's being recorded.
Yeah. So another question is, can we request that people wanting to attend the AGM RSVP as opposed to just generally sharing Zoom meeting access details? This question, it seems to me, goes to, you have a membership register. How are you going to check people into the meeting? And what do you do if somebody, like you do RSVP, but I haven't RSVP'd and I want to attend? Presumably you have to put the meeting details in the notice so that people that are wanting to sort of just show up have the ability to do so, right?
It may depend on the technology and also your ability to track who's attending, so to make sure there's no non-members who have snuck in.
Yeah.
And so that would be, I would say, if you'd like them to register, you can do so, but if somebody is absolutely insistent that I have a right to simply show up, I'm a member, well, they probably do. So, but you can just say, look, this is unusual times. Let's all be reasonable.
Yeah. I think this is also the time, if you are not accustomed to using a membership register or registry, that you look at it now. Who are your members? What are you sure they're your members? Have you communicated with them recently? Check in, make sure that your email addresses are up to date, all of that, so that you're not inadvertently dealing with someone, you know, on the day of. Also, I think that for the purposes of the chatting that goes on, you will not be able to be anonymous because it is a members meeting, and as a consequence, the society is really going to want to know that the people that are engaging there are in fact the people who are members of the society. Another question, what's the best practice to tally the votes when doing motions? Presumably, I move that we adopt the financial statements as presented by the board.
Well, at least some platforms, and I think this one, allow members to say yes or no or something to that effect. And that would be probably the simplest, where the chair instructs members, we are voting on approving the financial statements and auditor's report. If you're in favor, click yes. If you're opposed, click no. Doesn't allow for abstentions, but you'll ignore that. And then I take it that the moderator would then be able to record the totals.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is also going to be one of those points where we can't stress this enough. You're going to need people who can be monitoring what is happening, especially if you've got a lot of members. If your members are just the board, that's a different ball of wax. But if your meeting were like this one with over 300 people attending, then you're going to need somebody monitoring the various functions, because people will forget that, oh, I'm supposed to put the question in the Q&A box and do it in the chat function just because it's right in front of them and that's what they're used to. So it's good. That's a really important point. One of the comments that you made in the course of the discussion, Anders, is you said, postpone special resolutions to what or when? Wouldn't AGM be the preferred opportunity to pass a special resolution?
Yes.
So,
well, it's a matter of what will work for you and how important the resolution is and how much time and debate it might require. If, for example, a funder or the charities directorate wants something, well, you better go on with it. If it's really just a pruning the bylaws or modernizing them, well, maybe it can wait, maybe not. You'll have to decide, and it will partly depend on how contentious or not it would be for the members. But if it's required, of course, proceed.
Right, and it's one of those things that the more notice you give in advance about what is happening and why, and the more available the board is, for example, to take questions that people have. You might even consider holding a meeting prior to the AGM at which you invite people to just throw out their questions so that you're getting out as much of possible issues as beforehand.
Yes.
Another question, do we provide the whole AGM package in advance or just the agenda, especially if there's no resolutions?
Well, my view is that this year particularly, there's the more communication within reason, the better. At some point, you're going to have to send the members these things electronically anyway. So if they have documents in advance, well, they've got them and you're taken care of. On a completely separate note, and I know that you're all finishing your lunches and maybe getting bored, is we didn't mention a possibility, which is that if you're in a society with very few members, perhaps just the directors and maybe no one else, that if they unanimously agree in writing, you may not have to have an annual general meeting at all. You can do the business by unanimous members' resolution.
Right.
It's worth looking at.
Yes, that is pursuant to the BC Societies Act. So for those of you who are listening from Ontario, we're not sure what the statute in Ontario says vis-a-vis being able to proceed by way of consent resolution. Question here about proxy votes and how whether they would be counted towards determining quorum.
Well, you have to look and see if the bylaws allow proxies, and if so, what the rules are. My the challenge this year is going to be how can somebody prove to you that they hold a valid proxy? If you think it through, usually somebody shows up at the annual meeting or maybe at the office the day before and plunk, here's my proxies, all signed and ready to go. You can't do that electronically. My advice would be to avoid proxy voting, because if somebody, well, given that if the meeting's happening electronically, why is it that somebody can't attend it? Yeah. Why do they need somebody to vote for them? They can call in themselves.
Yeah. And I think, the reason that I selected this question is partly because I really think that there are some folks who have proxy voting in their bylaws that are quite outdated, or they're a board that has acquired this practice without really ever thinking about why do we even have this process. And particularly now that certainly in BC and indeed in many other provinces, electronic meetings are permissible, electronic members meetings are permissible, and the technology is improving dramatically. One really does have to question why we have proxies and whether or not that's something to consider for the future. There's also another reality, which is that even though we may be going to an electronic meeting, we may also have an opportunity to, if we absolutely have to address proxies, to have a meeting place that would allow for physical distancing, that would be, assuming you had an individual who's prepared to, say, sit in the auditorium of the West End Community Center, for example, at a distance, with PPE or whatever they feel is necessary for their own protection, to accept proxies from voting members. Again, assuming that you can substantiate their holding these proxies legitimately. So, like secret ballots, it's going to raise some challenges and really does also make you think about, okay, if we don't have to have an election or a vote, let's defer something till later. So there may be, as Anders said, you may want to change the bylaws, but you don't need to at this moment. And you could defer that for 6 months or even until the next annual general meeting. So I know, we have another bunch of questions. Shall we continue for 5 minutes, Anders? Is that okay?
It's fine with me. I hope they're good ones.
Yeah, well, I'll just scroll through here. Well, here's a good question. This is, can we just decide, we being the board of directors, I presume, decide on any of these meeting restrictions or logistics without needing agreement from the membership?
Generally, this statute and the bylaws give the power to call and therefore organize AGMs, subject, of course, to whatever the act and the bylaws require and allow. So it's up to the board to organize the AGM.
Yeah. Is it recommended to split the traffic control, so the technical side, and the chair of the meeting content control?
It seems to work well, especially as the meeting gets larger.
Yeah, and I think we've covered that. And I think also, this is an opportunity for some of the societies, some nonprofits, to test run what an electronic or teleconference mediated AGM looks like, and to think about putting the provision in your bylaws that sets out that the board of directors may opt to have electronic meetings. Here's a question, Anders. Is that bylaw provision required before you can hold a virtual AGM? So you don't know, we're out of COVID. Now we're a year from now, God willing. And what's the situation at that point?
Well, in BC, under the Societies Act, you are allowed to have virtual AGMs unless the bylaws say otherwise. That is in normal times. So if your bylaws don't say anything about it now, you're free to have virtual AGMs.
Yes. The reason that we recommend having something in your bylaws, or those of us who would recommend that, is so that the board is empowered to make these decisions, and also has given some thought to some of the issues that could arise. And I'll point folks to the FAQ section of the PLEO Law for Nonprofits.ca website. We have a link to our FAQs around the New Societies Act. And there's actually a sample bylaw that I believe that you developed, Anders, you and Michael, when you did a session for Continuing Legal Education BC, and we had your permission to put it on our FAQs. Yes. So it's there somewhere. Yes. And as we're migrating content to our newer website, the pacificlegaloutreach.com website, we'll work on getting more of that information made available, more easy to find in the future. The last question now I'm going to go to, and we will take these questions and try and answer some of them after on the either in the info sheet or in FAQs over the summer, mainly because I think it's an important thing to remind people about. Did I hear you say that non-members are not permitted to attend the AGM? Our bylaws do not prohibit guests from attending.
The general legal principle is that it's a meeting of the members of the society, and only the members have the right to attend, as well as any guests who may be invited to attend by the board, or permitted, if you want to be formal, permitted by ordinary resolution of the members. The only other person who has a right to attend is the auditor, if you have one.
Right. And I think I chose that in part because you may have a habit of inviting funders, inviting other people to attend the AGM. Do bear in mind that the more people that you have in this kind of platform, just as today, the more complicated it will be, because as you know, we're going to have some resolutions that are going to be adopting or accepting financial statements, various bits of business that your non-members are not going to be able to vote on. So if you were using an application like a polling, and it were anonymous, we won't know if your non-members think they should be voting along with everybody else. And so I think that you need to really think through who's normally there, and perhaps for some of those guests, you let them know that in these extraordinary circumstances that we're all in today, we're going to limit the meeting to members, or we're going to have another kind of meeting beforehand or something that would be a community meeting with funders and others where there's no voting and there's no formal process. So thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you Charity Village for supporting us in this effort. We had close to 600 people register, so this is an extraordinary, we get that this is a significant need. Thanks, Anders, for giving us an hour over lunch. And thanks to our captioners, as always, for making this accessible to folks who need it. And I will leave it today with, again, many thanks to all, and we'll see you next week. No, 2 weeks from now. It's going to be a little different. We're going to be doing a do's and don'ts for nonprofits. It'll be a 2-hour workshop. There is a small fee attached. And we're going to be going through, you know, if you want to start a nonprofit or you're new to being with a new nonprofit or a new board, just some tips on what maybe not to do moving forward and what to do moving forward. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks to PLEO and Charity Village.
Bye.